A few miles west of Union Station in Denver is our next stop in Golden. The Colorado Railroad Museum has an outstanding collection of railroad equipment that represents the history of Colorado railroading, as well as a large archival collection inside. Here, visitors can browse through displays depicting Colorado's rich railroading history. The outdoor displays showcase notable locomotives such as Burlington Route 5629, which is an example of a large steam locomotive, Rio Grande 5771, which is a 1950s-era diesel, and Rio Grande number 491, which is a narrow-gauge steam locomotive. Now, during the course of this program, we'll be visiting several narrow-gauge railroads. Narrow-gauge track is closer together than the rails most of us see every day. Here we see a display of 3-rail track with the 3-foot-wide narrow gauge running inside. One of the most famous narrow gauge railroads was the Rio Grande Southern, which was once located in southwestern Colorado. The crown jewel of the museum is locomotive number 346. This narrow gauge locomotive was built in 1881 for the Denver and Rio Grande and is operated all over Colorado. 346 still works and is run a few times a year for all to enjoy. Today, the 346 is borrowing the tender from sister 318. If you're interested in Colorado history, the Colorado Railroad Museum should be high on your list of places to visit. In southwest Colorado is another of the world's famous train rides, the Durango and Silverton Narrow Gauge Railroad, which runs for 45 miles between its two namesake cities. Durango was founded by the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad in 1879, and the historic district preserves the old times. The centerpiece of the area is the railroad station, our gateway to a fantastic train ride. The Durango and Silverton uses narrow gauge equipment from the Rio Grande Railroad, and mornings are a special time at the Roundhouse as the 1920-era steam locomotives are readied for the day's runs. Also at the Roundhouse is a museum where visitors can get up close to some of the railroad's historic equipment. Leaving Durango, the train runs alongside the Animas River, which we will follow all the way to Silverton. The railroad begins in a wide, flat valley, but we will soon start climbing up into the mountains.
Thank you very much.
As the train climbs up out of the valley, passengers can look ahead for a glimpse of the scenery to come. One of the scenic highlights of the trip is when the train makes its way along the High Line, which is a narrow shelf over 400 feet above the raging river below. After traversing the High Line, the railroad returns to river level and will follow the beautiful Animas all the way to Silverton with high peaks looming overhead. A particularly stunning part of the trip is the section north of Needleton Siding, where passengers can gaze at several peaks over 13,000 feet high in the Grenadier Range. Silverton is an old Colorado mining town and is an interesting place to visit in its own right. Miners once hauled out silver by the ton, thus the town's name and the reason for the railroad to be here. The Durango in Silverton is one of Colorado's most revered historical and scenic attractions, something that you just have to experience for yourself. In the far southern part of the state, in the small town of Antonito, is another railroad that can be listed among the world's finest train rides. The Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad runs trains along 64 miles of narrow-gauge track between here and Chama, New Mexico. Antonito is a small farming community located in Colorado's San Luis Valley. Departing Antonito, the train traverses an area that looks straight out of the Wild West. This part of the line has in fact served as the backdrop for several Western movies. The Cumbres and Toltec was built in 1880 as part of the Denver and Rio Grande's extensive narrow-gauge system. Until the last Rio Grande train ran through here in December of 1968, this railroad and the line between Durango and Silverton were part of the same route. If the locomotives on the Cumbres and Toltec look similar to the ones on the Durango and Silverton, it is because most of them are sisters. Every engine that is now in Durango passed through here, and every locomotive on the Cumbres and Toltec once ran into Durango. In 1970, the states of Colorado and New Mexico bought the part of the line between Antonito and Chama to save as a living history museum and tourist attraction. The rest of the railroad between Chama and Durango wasn't so lucky and was torn up. In the first 15 miles out of Antonito, the train has left the San Luis Valley behind and is now in an area with lots of ponderosa pine and aspen. Our train is steadily climbing. Antonito is at an elevation of 7,888 feet above sea level, but will soon crest 10,000 feet at Colorado's Cumbres Pass. At the ghost town of Sublette, New Mexico, our train stops for water. Now you may be wondering why we are showing scenes outside of Colorado. The railroad crosses the boundary between Colorado and New Mexico 11 times. Thus, the New Mexico portions of the line will be included in this program as they are all part of the same train ride.
Well, the Cumbres and Toltec is 64 miles long. And of those 64 miles, it's almost split equally between the two states of Colorado and New Mexico. And it's interesting that when you depart Antonito, Colorado, you spend more railroad miles in New Mexico. You depart Chama, New Mexico, and you spend more railroad miles in Colorado. And you meet in Colorado. So it's just intertwined between the two states. And so it was a natural for the states of Colorado and New Mexico to buy this railroad.
Leaving Sublette, the railroad passes above the beautiful Los Pinos Valley. We're approaching Rock Tunnel. Upon exiting the tunnel, we'll look down several hundred feet into the rugged Toltec Gorge. After a brief lunch stop at the ghost town of Osier, Colorado, the railroad continues climbing toward Cumbres Pass. Our train has arrived at 10,000-foot Cumbres Pass, which means summits in Spanish. From here, we'll go 14 miles west to watch the train from Chama. Chama, New Mexico is at the western end of the railroad. Located here are many railroad structures from the 1920s and before.
I believe this is a particularly useful railroad historically because we have more of both the history, the equipment, and the buildings left on this railroad than any other railroad that I can think of. And it's so important as a part of Colorado history that we have these essential elements, and they've been preserved. And it was a fluke that it was preserved because time sort of passed this railroad by and just didn't get developed in the same way that the other ones did. They kept using it, they find another excuse to keep using the railroad, but then they just never got around to improving it like everything else. And so we have the buildings that were still here that are really a great representation of the history of this 120-year-old rail line.
The climb up from Chama to Cumbres is one of the great spectacles in steam railroading, with 12 miles of 4% grade that often requires 2 steam locomotives to pull the train. The train crosses into Colorado at the water station at Cresco. Not every train stops here, but when they do, it's a treat to watch the full throttle departure. We're approaching Cumbres Pass once again. Being 64 miles long, the Cumbres in Toltec offers a variety of travel options that allow visitors to take all or part of the trip. Do yourself a favor and plan to spend the day at this fantastic steam railroad. Colorado is a state with diverse, lovely scenery. The next time that you're in Colorado sightseeing, why not leave your car at the railroad depot and see Colorado the way that it is best seen, through the window of a train?